So, for those who don't know Carlo Acutis, I will share this news, which mentions that the Catholic Church is about to canonize its first gamer saint. And yes, one of the games he liked the most was Halo. That's why I put the Halo image. Halo, in English, means halo, right? Therefore, in the British article from PC Gamer, they considered the pun relevant, although they mentioned that Carlo Acutis played Halo, a first-person shooter for Xbox and PC, as well as playing Super Mario and Pokemon. He is someone from my generation, right? He came into the world in 91, and then in 92, which makes him known as the first saint, or the first millennial saint. This term refers to people who were born in the early 80s to the mid-90s. I find this idea of the millennial generation Z a bit ridiculous, but it's one of the names given, right? Therefore, he is the first millennial saint, the first saint who plays, and the first influencer saint, as he used the internet intensively, in the early days of high-speed internet, to carry out evangelization. Carlo Acutis has the characteristic of being quite contemporary in various aspects and young, doesn't he? He passed away at the age of 15. I will tell a little about his story here, but he passed away at the age of 15. Therefore, it is understandable that we find it strange to come across an image in a color photograph, to begin with, since we are used to seeing images of saints. When we encounter images of saints, they are usually in black and white, in a very old style, but most of the time, we see saints depicted in icons, painted in a medieval style. It is really quite distinct to see an image, a saint depicted in a photograph like this, isn't it? This is the body of Carlo Acutis, but it's not exactly his body, right? I will comment a bit on this that causes some noise, but it doesn't refer to his body. But a part of his body is here in a church, right? Santa Maria Maggiore, which is very traditional in Assisi, in a private chapel of this complex. He's in a box, that is, protected in some way. The church has a very old style, almost medieval, if I'm not mistaken, which creates a significant contrast. He is wearing a sweatshirt and Nike sneakers. It is, in fact, quite intriguing and arouses great interest. There you observe these quite conventional people, surrounded by a ceremony and a rather classic gravity, in relation to such a young figure. It's to establish a contrast, so we can compare, right? Another image I placed on the cover is a relic of a much older saint, Saint Anthony of Padua, dating back to the 11th century. When I, at least, have a perspective more focused on the saints, especially within the context of the Catholic tradition, I immediately recall examples that resemble this one. It is important to emphasize that we should disregard these two mentioned little balls. This is a flash effect, but it is the jawbone of Saint Anthony of Padua and his tongue, which were kept as relics here. So, in this matter, are a kind of a reliquary, right? But it has this halo. Finally, the contrast is really quite significant. Therefore, I believe this is one of the reasons that arouses curiosity about Carlo Acutis, right? But who is Carlo Acutis, after all? Carlo Acutis was born in 1991, as I mentioned, in London, but this happened almost by chance, since his parents are Italian and he spent most of his life in Italy. Since childhood, he showed a great interest. He grew up in a family that was not very religious, but they had a Polish nanny who was devout. He came from a wealthy family in Italy, which is why he had a Polish nanny living there. The Polish nanny named Beta was really very religious. Her name was Beta, but she was very devout, Catholic, and taught Carlo various things about Catholicism. Carlo Acutis sparked a huge interest in the Catholic tradition. Since childhood, he developed a particular interest in Eucharistic miracles, didn't he? What are Eucharistic miracles? They are stories about miracles associated with the Eucharist. For example, a host that visibly manifested as the true flesh of Jesus, or a chalice containing wine that effectively turned into blood, in a clear and evident manner, right? Therefore, situations like these. He began to gather information on Eucharistic miracles and also to document Marian apparitions, such as those at Fatima, Aparecida, Guadalupe, among others. He created an extensive catalogue that covers these two subjects, using the internet to share his findings. He set up some websites where he published and promoted this information. At the beginning of high-speed internet, right? It is for this reason that he receives the title of First Saint Influencer, as well as the First Saint YouTuber, although he is not a proper YouTuber, but rather a video maker. He produced videos to address these topics from a very young age, around 11 years old. He didn't have much time to continue with it, as he was diagnosed with leukemia at the age of 15. A few days, or perhaps just a few weeks after his hospitalization, he passed away. From that moment on, the people who had the opportunity to know Carlo, and who noticed in him a devotion that stood out significantly, as well as truly exceptional Catholic virtues, began to make recommendations and requested the opening of Carlo's canonization process. That is, the possibility of officially recognizing him as a saint. Just as it happened with Carlo Acutis. How did this process unfold? So, I will detail the process later, but what is relevant to his case is that, to progress from the stage of venerable to blessed, which is the stage that precedes the recognition of sainthood, it is necessary for a miracle to be confirmed and verified. It is evident that this miracle is proven, right? Who makes this decision is the Catholic Church organization itself. Yes, there are some procedures that include evaluation by medical boards, among others, to determine if the miracle can have a scientific explanation. If it is not possible, if it makes sense from a theological point of view, then it is related to the saint. So, in the case of Carlo Acutis, after his death, a relic, which is a piece of his clothing, I believe, has already arrived in Brazil, more specifically in Campo Grande, in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul. A family that had a boy with a problem in his pancreas went to a church and prayed asking for Carlo Acutis' intercession for the boy's healing, bringing this relic, that is, a piece of his clothing, which was in a reliquary. A few days later, the boy appeared healed. Therefore, this is the record that exists, right? This was evaluated by healthcare professionals. The church itself, which is called, was unable to locate a team of doctors. However, it is seen as an autonomous board. They stated that, in fact, there was no medical explanation they could find for it. A commission of theologians stated that this was reasonable, since his reliquary was present, and the family clearly requested the intervention of this saint. Thus, the first miracle of Carlo Acutis in Brazil was officially recognized. That's why this matter is also relevant to Brazil, isn't it? So, after that, he was beatified, and to go from blessed to saint, an additional miracle is required. So, a second miracle occurred, didn't it? Certainly, from the perspective of those involved in this process and who support the way it is conducted, a second miracle occurred related to a Costa Rican in Italy who suffered a bicycle accident, resulting in a traumatic brain injury. The family also requested that Carlo Acutis intercede with God for miraculous healing at that location. The healing occurred and was credited to that prayer. After this internal investigation, they confirmed the second miracle. And now, in 2025, he was canonized this morning, being officially recognized by the church as a saint. So, this is essentially the narrative of Carlo Acutis. Once again, right? This causes a certain strangeness, as it is about a teenager who has not yet turned 15. Therefore, in all the photos we have of him, he appears as a boy with a backpack, dressed in a sweatshirt, who liked to play Super Mario and also played Hilo, a shooting game for the computer. And he is, today, alongside personalities such as Saint Francis of Assisi, Saint Augustine of Hippo, and Saint Stephen, the protomartyr, among others. However, this is an intriguing characteristic for an institution as ancient as the Catholic Church, which, despite its long history, remains alive and relevant, doesn't it? Therefore, people still identify as Catholics. There are many Catholic churches in operation, and a large number of Catholics around the world. It makes no sense to claim that saints ceased to exist or to manifest in the Middle Ages, right? Therefore, the process continues. But, for those of us who live in this period, I believe that when someone is very similar to us, it becomes difficult to see them as a holy person, doesn't it? There is a passage in the Gospels that is curious, when people begin to acclaim Jesus as a miracle worker. Then a group of people who knew Jesus appeared and said, "Hey, isn't this the carpenter's son? So, I know this guy, and there's no way this individual can be him, right? If there is a Messiah, he is certainly a remote figure and so on." However, when it comes to something that touches us closely, it really becomes complicated, doesn't it? It's about having that appropriate distance to the point where the person can pay a tribute, right? To adore a guy with a backpack in a picture. But, in essence, this is the story of Carlo Acutis, who, I believe, serves a purpose within a strategy of the Church, of course not limited to that. It is interesting for the Church to have a figure that illustrates the possibility of holiness, of someone like us who achieved this status. He was an exceptional young man, according to the accounts of those who knew him. The accounts were organized based on interviews with family, friends, colleagues, among others. He was an extraordinary boy and liked to play video games, among other things. Thus, in a way, It is an accessible path to achieving holiness. I think that, for the Catholic Church, from an institutional, pedagogical, and strategic perspective, the canonization of Carlo Acutis is indeed very significant, isn't it? For this reason, a saint who has gained considerable notoriety is also known as the patron of the Internet. Therefore, the Church has a recent existence in relation to the presence of the Internet. The Internet has completely transformed social interactions and even psychological dynamics, influencing the way we perceive life. There's no way the Church can remain indifferent to this, right? It also takes on the role of someone who approves of the Internet, as long as it is used constructively, as Carlo Acutis would have done. I think that, from the perspective of the history of religions and the sociology of religions, it is an event of great importance. Since we're talking about bones, I mentioned that I would address Carlo Acutis' body here, right? I ended up not mentioning it, but there's this curious aspect where, when looking at Carlo Acutis, it gives the impression that he is just sleeping. However, there is an element present in the veneration of saints and relics within this context, isn't there? There is a notion related to saints whose bodies remain incorrupt, that is, those saints who have passed away but whose bodies are still miraculously preserved. This is not the case with Carlo Acutis. His body is only partially present, with most of what is seen being a wax reconstruction. No, this is not the face of Carlo Acutis. He is inspired, quite evidently, by the real appearance of Carlo Acutis, which is this one here. However, this is not the true face of Carlo Acutis, nor is it an embalming or an aesthetic treatment applied to his original face. No, his head is not present here, right? At least the face is not present here. I'm not sure if Carlo Acutis' real skull is actually inside this mold, which is the wax production here. Yes, but I am aware that a part of his body, as stated by the guardian himself, who I am not sure if he is a bishop or a priest, of the chapel where his body is located, in Santa Maria Maggiore, a part of Carlo Acutis' body still remains here, under this reconstructed appearance, while another part is being prepared to be displayed in the form of relics. Therefore, there will be a part of Carlo Acutis' bone that will be displayed in some church or parish, among other places, right? Objects that belonged to him, therefore, became secondary relics, such as fragments of his clothing, like in the case of the garment worn by the boy who, according to reports, was cured of a condition related to the pancreas. So, there is all this care taken after death to prepare these relics. Therefore, instead of leaving the person's body buried, you will make it circular, as in a way, it acts as a channel of power. Explain theologically in whatever way you prefer, but there is a connection between this physical element and power. This power comes from wherever you choose to place it. Therefore, in this aspect, we are quite aligned with the representations that emerge among non-Christian critics of the cult of saints, which depict bodies being exhumed and transported. This happens, but from a Catholic perspective, these bodies are not scattered as fragments of corpses, for instead of polluting, they purify and sanctify. Thank you for staying with us. May God bless you, and don't forget to check out some of the other videos available here on the side.